We're live here in. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Emerging Revolutionaries Wars Rev War Revelry. Tonight, obviously, we're taking a break from the Revolutionary War to talk before dawn's early light, Bladensburg and the road to Fort McHenry. Waving onto the screen is my co-patriot tonight, Daniel Davis, who's the Senior Education Manager for the American Battlefield Trust, and a great historian in his own right. With that being said, we would like to thank the American Battlefield Trust for co-hosting this Rev War Revelry tonight. So thank you, Dan, for joining us as we talk War of 1812.
Yeah, man, you bet. Thanks for having me back. It's always good to come back and talk history on Sunday nights with you folks.
Exactly. And since we're going to be talking about Maryland, I figured I would go as about a Maryland or Baltimore out. So Baltimore, Jersey, Orioles are actually on back in the winning streak, the Maryland flag behind me. But as we discuss Maryland, and of course, the beverage in hand, if people can see it, Walt Disney World, American flag. So doing it all tonight to encapsulate the whole scene. So with that being said, let's dive in. So we're going to start with that 50,000 foot view, as Chris White from the American Battlefield Trust likes to say. Chesapeake, road to Bladensburg. Can you get us there, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. The United States obviously declares war on Great Britain, June of 1812. President James Madison, one of his main goals is actually the conquest of Canada. And through the first year or so, a year or two of the war, 1812 going into 1813, much of the U.S.'s effort is focused on Canada, along with reclaiming territory lost in the Old Northwest after the fall of Detroit in the summer of 1812, and then slowly William Henry Harrison slowly rebuilds the United States forces out west and begins his ultimate advance on Detroit. But because the United States is so focused on the U.S., it's going to put Britain in somewhat of a corner. Great Britain at the same time is dealing with Emperor Napoleon in Europe. A lot of their resources, a lot of their men are delegated to engaging and defeating Napoleon. So they haven't had yet the time to really put forth an effort into the war in North America. So what they would like to do, what the British conclude is the best way to take pressure off of Canada with the limited resources they have at the time is to open up a new theater somewhere along the Atlantic coast. They choose the Chesapeake. Now, there has been some discussion amongst the historical community as whether or not the British chose the Chesapeake, mainly due to the fact that because you have the Chesapeake, Potomac River, and the many rivers that you can move up to through Virginia, through Maryland. It was a very large privateering area for the Americans. There's been some debate regarding how effective the privateers were operating out of the Chesapeake, up and down the Chesapeake Bay, and then even out into the Atlantic Ocean. That still remains in question as to how much the privateers were actually able to force Britain to force their hand to open up that new theater. From my 2 cents, the British need to open up a new theater somewhere in North America to take the pressure off of Canada, and at the same time to take pressure off of what's happening in Europe. So they choose the Chesapeake. Whether or not it was due to the privateering activities, again, that's up for debate. But really, 1813, much of 1814, I'm going to pull up a image here. Hold on just a moment. British Admiral, a fellow named George Cockburn, is going to begin leading naval expeditions. He's actually the second in command of the British force in the Chesapeake, but he's going to begin leading expeditions really throughout, hold on a second, really throughout the Chesapeake. There's fighting around Norfolk, Hampton Roads, Newport News area in Virginia. He obviously would famously move into Maryland and burn Havre de Grace. I'm going to pull up Cockburn here.
And he can as you bring up the map, he's pretty much going at will, picking off little towns, hamlets, even raiding into the northern neck of Virginia, and basically just going at will for much of even the year previous as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because the British are really running, to say the least, roughshod over the American forces, mainly American militia that's operating in the area, operating in the Chesapeake region, Virginia, Maryland, around Washington, D.C. You can see here Admiral Coburn. This is a painting that was made obviously after the war, but after, you can see in the background the burning of Washington. Coburn is going to be there on the field, or he's still the second in command of the British Navy, operating in the area when the British burned Washington in the summer of 1814. But what's really interesting about this is that the British strategy of opening up this new theater, this new sector in North America, really doesn't come to fruition. The British are operating literally in President James Madison's backyard throughout the Chesapeake region. And it's interesting that Madison really does not take or pull resources from other parts of the country and really delegate them to dealing with the British, which is, it's somewhat fascinating that, you know, British ships are running up and down the Chesapeake Bay, as Phil, as you mentioned, pretty much at their own free will.
And I mean, as they do that too, not only is Madison not allocating, but he's also facing a Secretary of War, John Armstrong, who doesn't believe there is a serious threat to the Mid-Atlantic, that most of the action he's turned toward that Canadian frontier, where the United States forces have made multiple excursions across and had very bad luck and besides, when they burn or torch some of the Canadian towns that may lead to retribution in 1814. We can get that to there in a few minutes, but but it is true. I mean, there's also a very small Navy flotilla that the Americans have, and it's really carte blanche, and then it revs up as we move into the summer of 1814. Correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And the reason why it revs up and the British are able to allocate more resources to North America is that Napoleon is defeated. He abdicates, leaves the continent of Europe, goes to Elba, and now the British are left to focus solely on North America. And in the summer of 1814, I'm going to do another screen share here in just a second. In the summer of 1814, the new British commander naval commander in North America, this fellow, Admiral Alexander Cochrane, is going to put forth a plan to the British Admiralty that is going to not only focus on the Chesapeake, but Cochrane's big goal, and I think this kind of gets lost sort of in the translation about what happens in Washington, what happens in Baltimore in summer and early fall of 1814. But Cochrane's goal is to capture New Orleans. New Orleans is one of the richest cities in the United States. There's at least, I think, 1/3 of American commerce moves down the Mississippi through New Orleans because of the British blockade. There's something over $1 million worth of cotton just sitting on the docks, waiting to be picked up, scooped up by the British. So Cochrane is first going to continue operating in the Chesapeake region, and then he plans to move sometime in the summer, late summer, early fall, refit his command and move on New Orleans. But he's going to continue the operations that Coburn had been conducting throughout the course of the previous year.
And along with that is what they bring over infantry-wise as well. So we initially, of course, Coburn and all of them thought they would get a very large contingent of British reinforcements, up 10, 12,000, some of the numbers that historians have read through and so forth. But they get, I think, approximately 4,500 that come with, but it shows the seriousness of the British effort in this Chesapeake Mid-Atlantic region, because the gentleman they send to command them is Major General Robert Ross. Is that correct? Or is he a brigadier? Major.
He's a major general.
Major general. There it is.
Yeah, I just pulled him up on
there he is.
Pulled him on the screen here. Yeah, he comes over from Europe with the 4th, the 21st, 44th, and the 85th regiments of foot. Madison, to a certain degree, has been tipped off by his spies. The British are, in fact, sending reinforcements, and he will make some of the initial moves as to really organizing the forces in the Chesapeake under a fellow named William Winder. I'll pull up an image of him in just a moment, but Ross is going to be the Army commander, operating jointly, cooperating with Coburn with Cochrane during the operations in the Chesapeake in the summer of 1814. But also, we should remember too that Ross is also the Army commander slated to lead that expedition to New Orleans. And not to give away too much of the story, later on when he is killed at North Point in the fall during the fighting, the Battle of Baltimore, later on September of 1814, that will elevate Edward Michael Packenham to command the British that will eventually move New Orleans. And again, not giving away too much of the story, obviously Packenham is going to be mortally wounded. He's going to be killed at the Battle of New Orleans, 8th of January, 1815.
And it's doing some research prior to this revelry on Robert Ross, because a family connection is I did have an ancestor that was in the militia that fought at the Battle of North Point. He was not the one that struck Ross. Knowing anything about Greenwalts or Porters as they are, he probably would have missed them even if he was aiming for them. Not to disparage my ancestor, but so doing Ross is actually in the Napoleonic Wars fighting with Wellington, and he's actually severely wounded, has a grievous neck wound at the Battle of, or if I pronounce it right, Ortez, actually in the late February of 1814, and he's actually recovering, but he thinks duty is assigned, but he comes from a long lineage of officers. His father, I think, fought in the French and Indian War. He will fight in Italy and Egypt during the Napoleonic War. So it shows the seriousness. I mean, this is not just some second-tier general that the British are going to land and fight here in the Mid-Atlantic region.
No, and they are sending some quality, as well as not only Ross, but they are sending quality regiments, combat-ready regiments over to the Chesapeake.
And so as they they're in the Chesapeake. Okay, we got them on land. Now they're going to, unfortunately for the Americans, is figuring out where they're going to go. And so there are multiple avenues as they come up through southern Maryland and the peninsula there, correct?
Yeah, there is. And what's interesting about the expedition is that, or this particular expedition, August of 1814, Cochrane, Coburn, and Ross get together, obviously, in a number of councils of war. And Cochrane is he's actually somewhat reluctant to take the risk of landing troops in Maryland and having them march overland to capture or to attack Washington, D.C. It's interesting because Coburn and Ross actually talk him into the idea. He's reluctant to do it. Cochrane is reluctant from the perspective that he's concerned that there's really not a good landing place along the Chesapeake, in Maryland, where he can land his infantry forces, again, newly arrived from Europe, and be able to successfully march them overland without encountering stiff American resistance. But Coburn, who's been operating in the area, again, pretty much at his own free will for the last year, is able to convince Cochrane that, hey, listen, we have really not had any issues with the American militia, with the United States regular army in this area for the last year. There's no reason now to believe that we can make do on our own if we land, we engage the Americans, and we can get to Washington if we need to. The resistance from the Americans, again, has been very minimal over the course of the last year and a half. So ultimately, Cochrane is going to go with the suggestions of his subordinates. They're going to land August 19th and begin marching overland toward Washington. Now, the individual who I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the individual who is tasked with defending Maryland, essentially Maryland, D.C., and parts of Virginia north of the Rappahannock River, is this fellow, William Winder. Winder has cobbled together various some U.S. regular Army units, various militia units, obviously from the surrounding area, and he will ultimately take up a position in an area known as, oh gosh, I can't remember now. I think it's called Long Old Fields in Maryland, but hopefully somebody there in the chat can pop up and give me a helping hand on that one. Slipped my mind there for just a minute. But Winter's going to steadily withdraw back toward Washington, ultimately to defend the city itself. There are a couple of crossing points on what's known as at the time, the East Branch of the Potomac River. We know it today as the Anacostia River, below Washington City. However, the Americans have managed to burn or destroy the bridges across the Anacostia that would give the British Ross access into the city. But there's one bridge that is still standing. This is why this battle is fought. There's one bridge over the Anacostia that is still intact, that the Americans have left intact, and that is outside the village of Bladensburg, just several miles to this north and east of Washington.
And what's amazing, as the British, Madison does get notice, a guy named Albert Gallatin, who's serving as one of his commissioners over there in Europe, trying to look for peace, is sent back. Then, of course, Napoleon has abdicated that these are British reinforcements coming. Councils of war, which decide nothing, as Washington found out in the Revolution. Councils of war serve no action. Armstrong still is equivocal, blatantly obvious that if they do attack at all, it's going to be toward Baltimore, but he still doesn't think Washington is a main target, because he said it's inconsequential. What is there to capture besides a city? I mean, much like Philadelphia fell in 1777 with the in the Revolution, Armstrong also has designs for the presidency. So I mean, he's also slightly undermining his own commander in chief. So you have that infighting going on, plus the most of the regulars not being there. They don't. But you do have a small detachment of flotilla men under Joshua Barney, Marines, and so forth. And so, but what's amazing about Bladensburg is you have not only militia that kind of line up, but you see they try to recreate something from the American Revolution, that three-tiered defense. And so you have the first line, then you on the banks, sometimes referred to, I think, as the East Fork of the Potomac River, Anacostia, the names of the rivers changed there. And then a second line supposed to support, and the third line with some of the Marines, regulars, select militiamen, and Barney's flotilla. So you have this tier defense. Great map there, of course. And as you see today, unfortunately, the battlefield is mostly, or 99%, consumed by the urban sprawl of Washington, D.C. moving out there. But you have this guy, Secretary of State, comes in. I think we've heard his name before in the annals of American history, a guy named James Monroe. He would succeed, of course, Madison as president, become the 5th president of the United States. And he's out there also. You have too many hands in the pot, so to speak, and he starts to tinker with some of the alignment of it, and including moving some companies around as well. So that's what you have as the British arrive there late morning of August 24th, 1814. So anything, Danny, like that?
Just to your point about Washington and Baltimore. I mean, obviously Washington, you mentioned the British capturing Philadelphia in 1777 during the American Revolution. Just to your point, Washington is obviously the symbol of the new nation, but British are going to find this out firsthand. Well, for several weeks later, is that Armstrong has put more work into fortifying the city of Baltimore, because it is a major port city with access to the Chesapeake Bay and then out to, obviously, to the Atlantic, than he actually has in preparing the defenses of Washington.
No, exactly. And one of the major defenses of Washington, sitting on the lower Potomac, is Fort Washington.
Yeah.
And the British completely bypass it, showing its obsoleteness there. Amazing brick fort that could have held them up, but with all these other avenues of approaches, the Americans just don't have the wherewithal and of where the British are coming, and they're thinking Baltimore because of its port, because of its symbolism as well of where these privateers are coming out of. And to capture that, you could almost say that if you capture Baltimore, you strategically outflank Washington, D.C. as well.
Yeah.
And so you would have that on the opening actions there. So the British have come up. They're about to take onto the field. American numbers. The Americans actually number them, and we have a great point actually coming in. The guns at Fort Washington could not reach the British ships, even if they could, but it's a point obviously the British didn't even want to contend with. Obviously they will capture raid up through Alexandria and so forth, but the Americans will actually abandon the fort. And I think it's actually Fort 2 as Fort Warburton or something, and then switches over. So before someone catches me on that, Warburton, then Washington. I'm just jumping the gun there a little bit for giving George more credit. So initially, though, the first line for the Americans do hold. The initial attack by the British focused on the bridge is repulsed, correct?
Yeah, that is correct. There's a fellow named William Pickney who commands the 1st Maryland Rifles. It's a rifle unit. They engaged the 85th Regiment of Foot. There's, I believe, an excellent account. In fact, not only just an excellent account from the Chesapeake campaign, but from the New Orleans campaign, from a soldier. He's an officer named George Gallegh. He serves in the 85th Regiment of Foot. He's at Bladensburg. He's at New Orleans. I would highly recommend folks going out and taking a look, trying to find his account. It's a fantastic first-person account, probably one of the best from a British officer, a British soldier during the War of 1812. But yeah, William Pickney's 1st Maryland Rifles are going to engage the 85th Regiment of Foot around the bridge, in the bridge area. The 85th is going to manage to push the 1st Maryland back into where you kind of see upper right-hand corner or upper right center of the map, the orchard area just above the name Thornton. William Thornton was one of the British brigade commanders operating under Robert Ross. The Americans then are going to counterattack. Pickney, however, commander of the 1st Maryland Rifles, is going to receive a severe wound, but along with Joseph Sterrett's 5th Regiment of Maryland Volunteers and some of Pickney's riflemen, they're going to launch a counterattack and start to push back the 85th. But by this point in time, Ross is across the river. He's bringing more troops over to establish that and to maintain that bridgehead. And Ross is going to look at the American line. He's going to start sending, instead of attacking the Americans head on, he's going to start sending regiments around the flanks. 4th, 44th Regiment of Foot are going to begin moving around the flanks of the American line. And the American line is going to slowly begin to give way and to withdraw. Around the area of the American left flank in particular, there will be a brief counterattack by the Americans that will push the British back. The British in turn are going to advance, and that the second line that you see there is eventually going to collapse with the militia streaming back along Washington. You see Washington Pike, Georgetown Pike, headed back actually for the city of Washington. Now, Phil also mentioned that Winder had positioned his men on the west bank of the Anacostia in 3 separate lines, what we know today as a defense in depth. It's designed to delay an advancing enemy force and inflict as many casualties as possible while each successive line withdraws back to the final line. And there, ideally, a commander will launch a counterattack. Well, that doesn't happen at Bladensburg. I mean, Winder probably wanted to do something or executed a tactic such as that. However, his orders were not clear. They were not properly transmitted by staff officers. And instead of those militia, those men from the first 2 lines, instead of them falling back to the 3rd line, they take off. They're headed for Washington. They are driven off the field.
Yeah. No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Oh no, I was about to pass it over to you.
So, and as you do, though, that 3rd line though does hold. I mean, so it is unfortunately unceremoniously called the Bladensburg races because those lines are not within supporting distance, but the 3rd line does slightly hold up. You had mentioned Thornton. Thornton, I think, is wounded in the action at Bladensburg.
Yes, he is. Yeah.
And one of the guys too is Joshua Barney and his men. They do not get the order initially to retreat. They hold up, and eventually Barney is actually severely wounded in the thigh. They're defending the 3rd line, and but. Yep. Yeah.
Barney, a master commandant in the U.S. Navy. He's an interesting character into himself. I I'd highly recommend anybody who's interested in the Chesapeake region and the War of 1812, go out and go do some research on Joshua Barney. He's a highly effective naval officer that operated throughout the Chesapeake region during the War of 1812. Here he's on land with his sailors. He's back on the third line with some artillery. Artillery that has actually come out from the Navy Yard, and a fellow named Samuel Miller. He's a captain. And there's a small contingent of Marines that help hold the third line up, or help hold the third line, firing into the British, firing into Ross's ranks as they come forward. Some of the artillery is actually going to be able to, thanks to the efforts of Miller and that contingent of United States Marines, that he launched a counterattack, buying time for some of that artillery to get off the field and eventually reach the safety. But at the end of the day, as Phil mentioned, Bladensburg is known today as the Bladensburg races. And also, as he mentioned, sadly enough, much of it, one can imagine, much of the battlefield has been eaten up by the development of Washington, D.C. and by Bladensburg itself. But I will say there's a very nice trail that one can follow. You can follow the actions, follow the British advance. Starting in the town of Bladensburg, there are a number of historical markers there. And then you can follow the British attack as they move over the Anacostia and eventually cracking the third line, which leaves the Americans obviously streaming back toward Washington, D.C. Ross is going to march into Washington with his force, and we know today, burn the better part of Washington, loot the White House. The White House is going to be burned.
Yeah, and just before we do move completely away from Bladensburg, just a great point was made by someone listening in, saying that one of the reasons, of course, Barney is there is because he had to burn his ships on the Patuxent River. The British were able to bottle him up there. But Barney is just an amazing character. There's actually a great popular song at the time, Barney, Leave the Girls Alone. Apparently derives from his time during the American Revolution, when he actually delivered dispatches to France, and supposedly Marie Antoinette kissed his hand, or allowed him to kiss her hand, which was a thing. But I like to quote, sums up a lot of those swashbuckling captains, commodores that fought for the fledgling American Navy at this time. Of course, had gained a lot during the Barbary Coast Wars of the early 19th century. He said, someone said about Barney that to content himself with following the plow, watching the growth of his corn, or sharing his merinos while the blast of war was blowing in his ears would have been an effort beyond his philosophy. I just like that quote about Barney there. So there you go, one of those guys that an unsung hero of the War of 1812, but carrying on that rich tradition of the American U.S. Navy there. But also, before we as well, building on Dan's points about Bladensburg, is that there is that monument that you have there as well, yeah. Which I was in October of this past year out there. They were doing some reconstruction and refitting of it, so it was maxed up, but they're hoping to get it done here in the next few months. But also, as you drive up, although that road now is very busy, there are some great signage to pull off, and you can see where the American second line was. And even with that urban sprawl, there's a strip mall, and I think there's if I remember correctly, a Burger King or a fast food restaurant right there, but you can see the second line, you can see the elevation coming up and so forth. So it is a push. But as well, not only is Monroe out there, Armstrong, Winder, it is also President James Madison makes an appearance on the field. And it is I know there we have a lot of presidents, Grant, Eisenhower, and other ones that fought in wars and then served as president. But just a slight trivia here, everyone knows Lincoln is under fire at Fort Stevens in July of 1864. So there it is. We're at 7:30 before the really first Civil War mention here. So I don't know if that's a record or not, but Madison is also the only other sitting U.S. president to come under enemy fire in his presidency. So there on August 24th. So now the American forces are skedaddled as Madison's out there. The federal government is packing up what they can, shipping it out. Dahlia Madison, of course, is doing what she can, ignoring dinner. Supposedly the dinner is still laid out there at the White House, but packing up, including the Gilbert Stuart painting on Washington there. And so now this will probably open us up for debate, but as the British come in, technically they're supposed to build, or they're only going to go after buildings related to either the federal government or considered appropriate for the measures of war. Talking about the weirdness there, when Barney is captured as well, they congratulate him and release him because of his heroic stand. So you have war, things are inbounds, things are out of bounds, but then supposedly there is a pot shot or two taken at the British. Is that correct? Have you heard the same thing, Dan, or is this just mythology?
Yeah, it's hard to say, really. I don't think we'll ever know. Bearing in mind, however, too, that Coburn and Ross, I mean, Coburn was not outside the realm of bringing, here we go with another Civil War related term, bringing the hard hand of war to the Chesapeake. The British, Cochrane, Coburn, and Ross were well aware of what had happened during the fighting in York and Canada, as well as I believe there's another town that the Americans that spring in Canada, it was called Port Dover. They looted and burned several warehouses there. So they're well aware of the conduct of the Americans when it comes to the occupying cities in Canada. And again, the previous year, Coburn had burned a large part of Havre de Grace in Maryland. They're not outside the realm of putting buildings to the torch and making the war as difficult as possible, not only in the military, but also in the U.S. civilians.
So there it is. They captured Washington, D.C., but what good in the large picture of it does besides claiming this is not like a European war, once again, hit the capital, sue for peace, so forth. But it's strategic in the way that potentially it could be a building block as peace, because although there's a movement initially to try to figure out something in Europe, the American commissioners start to realize the British are sending second-rate commissioners, not their top brass, but also it's kind of stonewalling. They're holding for time to see what British forces can potentially peel off.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because Cochrane, we have to remember that through the course of this campaign, Cochrane's objective is not necessarily Baltimore, it's not necessarily Washington. He is continuing the raiding expeditions from the previous year, but he wants to get out of the Chesapeake. He wants to attack New Orleans. And I think that's somewhat, and that plays into his mindset as well, that these aren't his real objectives. He wants to go to the Gulf and operate along the Gulf Coast.
For those that do not understand that, why not the Chesapeake? Why New Orleans? In our 21st century mindset, you would seem tackle that eastern seaboard would be more important than New Orleans, but not to switch it too much down to the great Louisiana town that has great bourbon and crawfish and all that. But why New Orleans? Why are they fixated on that?
Well, again, it's one of the richest cities in the United States when the war breaks out. 1/3 of American commerce passes through New Orleans. So they give you an idea of what the type of economic impact that would have if the British were able to capture the city. Once New Orleans is captured, that opens up the Mississippi for British advance. So New Orleans is much more strategically important, economically important to the British, and a great prize. As Phil mentioned regarding commissioners and meeting in Europe, that would probably be the biggest bargaining chip the British could utilize during the treaty negotiations had they captured that city.
And let's just I don't hate playing the game what if, but let's throw a hypothetical out there. There is a young American officer whose star probably rises the highest out of any officer in the War of 1812, and that is a guy named Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott later on proposes almost the same thing, or be ridiculed as the Anaconda Plan. But if you think of the British view, they've already got the upper reaches, Canada. They push the American forces back, raiding the places like Detroit and so forth. So they're close to that end. They take New Orleans. They can kind of entrap, but also control the economic digress, much like the federal government will do during that later conflict to try to separate and keep control of the river. So you wonder how much reviewing after the War of 1812, a young Winfield Scott would put that in the back of his mind and realize the importance of controlling those rivers, especially in the heartland of the United States. But we did have, it is interesting, someone did ask, wasn't Charleston the richest city in the United States at this time?
Charleston, South
Carolina, yes.
It's one of, that's why, I try to, I don't want to say it's the, or anyone is the richest city, because you could probably make an argument for, obviously, for New York, for Charleston, as mentioned, New Orleans, obviously as well.
I think it's great to differentiate here is that there might have been more per capita richness, might have been more stuff or richer folks in the economy there, but New Orleans was the hub for things getting out. And so you have that whole commerce coming down the Mississippi River and coming out through New Orleans, of course, bringing with the French, Spanish influences. City is multicultural throughout its whole existence. And so, as William Thayer writes or said, it's interesting how New Orleans is so important to our early nation's history, and correct. That's why they Bob Horn, Billy Horton made a great song about Andrew Jackson and New Orleans. So, but Dan and I are neither singers, so we'll leave that up to the late great Horton to continue that. But moving back to Spotify, there you go. So the American forces now skedaddled through Bladensburg, considered maybe one of the worst American defeats up to that time, maybe top 5 in our nation's history of bad defeats. Just leave it at that. So now let's gear toward the dawn's early light, moving around. But however, before we do leave, and this side, of course, Francis Scott Key does play a role in some of the militia. One of the guys that is actually from that area of Maryland, who is known to the British, is that Dr. William Beans, who today, unfortunately, his house doesn't stand anymore. But his grave is marked, and it's accessible. You can actually go see it, visit the grave of Dr. Beans, who is the one that is actually held by the British, precipitating, of course, Francis Scott Key's visit out into the Baltimore Harbor. But the British got to get out of D.C. Let's get them to Charm City or Mob City, depending on which way you want to your loyalties lie. The city of Baltimore.
Yeah, it's as one can imagine, Ross, Coburn, they have a very easy march to get back to the cover of Cochrane's ships. Once they return to the ships, the 3 British officers will meet once again in Council of War. Cochrane actually feels it's time to get out of the Chesapeake. He wants to make an attempt he wants to sail north, get out of the Chesapeake, sail north, potentially raid New England, launch a few incursions into Rhode Island, but then he wants to then go on to Nova Scotia, rest his fleet, rest his troops, refit, repair his ships, and then he wants to leave Nova Scotia sometime later on in the fall, sail south, potentially raid the Carolinas and Georgia, and then move into an open operations along the Gulf Coast. But just like the attack on Washington, Coburn and Ross are going to talk Cochrane out of it, and they're going to tell Cochrane, we've just captured, we've just sacked Washington, we defeated a substantial American force, obviously Bladensburg, and we are riding a wave of momentum. The initiative is firmly in our hand. We need to attack Baltimore. So once again, Cochrane is going to allow himself to be talked into a plan that he doesn't necessarily go along with by his 2 subordinates, and the British are going to turn their focus and set their sights in the first couple weeks of September on Baltimore. And obviously, you're going to have the engagements around Baltimore, the landing at North Point, the Battle of North Point, where we talked a little bit earlier. Ross is going to lose his life. And obviously, we have the bombardment of Fort McHenry.
There you go. But so as we move toward Baltimore, the great points made by one of the comments is that it is Johnny Horton. I had his name wrong. So I had to write Horton, just didn't remember the first. I think there's an Tim Hortons or something is ice cream. Maybe that's where I was getting the mix up from.
Tim
But
Hortons, yeah, I think Tim Hortons has ice cream. They also have pretty good coffee and donuts.
There you go. So not a sponsorship for Tim Hortons, just trying to figure out where I got the name from. But also, yes, Francis Scott Key, another great point, writes a poem. I think it's a 6-stanza poem. It's been on display at Fort McHenry National Monument Historic Shrine. It is with the Historical Society, the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. So the music, of course, is put on later, but Francis Scott Key obviously writes the poem inspired there. But it's so North Point, of course, all the action, all the view is toward Fort McHenry, maybe rightfully so because of what happens there, the bombardment. But it's really that pincer movement that people don't understand. It's Fort McHenry and then swing around North Point, which does sit on a peninsula. Today, it is part of I think, a state park there as well. There are a few monuments, a mural as well to what happens at North Point. But you see the arrival of thousands of Maryland militia, including a guy that is very prominent in both the American Revolution, called back Major Samuel Smith.
General Smith.
General Smith, who had served in the American Revolution, has returned and been called back up for duty. He has a great statue on Federal Hill, which sits down, of course, in on the harbor at Baltimore. But also you have Pennsylvania militia start to respond as well. And a young gentleman that becomes the 15th president of the United States marches south with some of those militia as well. One of those presidents we probably will try to forget in history, Buchanan there, James Buchanan, the 15th president, of the United States, right before Abraham Lincoln. There, so they come down, including one of my ancestors in the Baltimore County or militia at the time, and so it is. But Ross, is actually turning away to bring up reinforcements when he is shot off his horse, and they believe they have a marker near where those American riflemen were. Basically, what's interesting this time is the Americans trying to provoke a battle. They understand, as a William Stryker and other ones, that the militia are going to start to get a little antsy the more they got to wait under arms. And so they're precipitating, trying to entice the British, and they kind of secede.
Yeah.
So with that, so we have the militia. At the same time, the bombardment of Fort McHenry dawns early light. Do you want to speak on that a little bit, or we can talk about Fort McHenry and see if we can avoid any mention to the Civil War with who the commander of Fort McHenry is?
Try to stay away from the Civil War. Obviously, just and keeping it at somewhat of a high level. Ross, as Phil mentioned, Ross is able to land his men on the peninsula of North Point, or around North Point, and begin making their way around toward the western end, or rather the eastern end, I should say, I apologize, of the city of Baltimore, where they engage U.S. forces. Ross is pushing his men ahead, as we've talked about. When he is shot and killed, the British attack somewhat loses momentum. Coburn and Ross are back in the ships in the harbor, I believe, and it really, when Ross goes down, the British movement, the land movement, really begins to fall apart. At the same time, Coburn and Cochrane are going to open up on Fort McHenry, guarding the entrance to Baltimore Harbor. Now, Fort McHenry, I will mention, is not the only fort in Baltimore. There are a number of other fortifications that have been constructed around the harbor and near Fort McHenry. If you get a chance to absolutely go visit it today, it's a wonderful site to help defend the city. The fort's commander, George Armistead, is going to hold off during the bombardment, eventually forcing Cochrane, after they are unable to break or make any headway at McHenry, reducing the guns, or reducing the fort. Cochrane and Coburn are going to disengage and sail back out into the Chesapeake and essentially withdraw from Baltimore.
And as they do, of course, Fort McHenry, one of the things, it is named after James McHenry, who is the Secretary of War. I think he's the second Secretary of War under the Washington administration, because he replaces Henry Knox. And also, and he does survive, or does stay in that during the changeover. And I think he's the initial Secretary of War for John Adams too, because he does keep a intimate relationship with Washington, actually sending him letters and so forth. And then, of course, being slightly instrumental in bringing Washington back in a pseudo role during what would become the quasi-war, 1797 to or 1799, excuse me, to 1801. So when Washington unfortunately passes away, luckily no action ever takes place between the Americans and the French. But what's neat about Fort McHenry too, talking about some of the preservation, obviously North Point is in spots and in parts. Fort McHenry is the only national park site that has actually a double designation. So it is Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine. And today it actually has redone the visitor center in time for the 200th anniversary in 2014. The fort is there. They've also tried to mark out buoys out in the bay there to show where the British ships were, and so forth. And then up the road is what the Mary Pickersgill House, or Flag House. Of course, George Armistead has told him to make a flag that could be seen, and so forth. And Baltimoreans respond, so they do that. So there are some sites there to see, along with the other work, the 1812 sites. But what is also amazing is that the Battle of North Point slows the British down, but they do creep closer and closer until they realize the Americans this time have really fortified Baltimore. And they actually, I think the estimates range that they thought there was as many as 22,000 militia and 100 cannons manning. And so they do prepare a night attack. They thought it was going to happen. But unfortunately, or fortunately for a lot of British, it does not go off. And so it's still referred to today as the state holiday of Defenders Day. So Maryland is very prideful of that. But we're winding down here, a little over 10 minutes to go. So I want to move a little bit over to see if there's no questions, but talk a little bit about the preservation movement. We've talked about all these battlefields being disturbed or lost to urban sprawl. But a few years ago, the National Park Service instituted what they call the Star Spangled Banner Trail. If I wonder where they got that name from there, but it does highlight mentions around the Chesapeake Bay area. We had a question earlier, where did some of the British raid besides Havre de Grace? It's Benedict, into Upper Marlborough, down into Virginia, places like Kinsale, they come into Virginia. And so there is a marker and signs that talk about the Star Spangled Banner Trail. And if you do go to Fort McHenry, they have a great map on the floor as well. Actually, I got a question just popped in. I don't know if we know the exact answer, but what percentage of Washington, D.C. was actually burned by the British?
It's actually a pretty small percentage. Bearing in mind that Washington, the city of 1812, the War of 1812 is not the city that we know it today. I believe the area we know today is Georgetown. There were actually two separate cities. There was but going back to the question, a very small percentage of the city was actually burned and destroyed by the British.
It is, and it's, I mean, things that are lost though is monument to government records, of course. Most of the initial Library of Congress, is that correct? I think
Library of Congress and Supreme Court, I believe. And
so they, I mean, that precipitates actually, I think Jefferson will donate most of his library to replace that as well. But so you have the Star Spangled Banner Trail. You can get the brochures, you can go online, the website there for the Star Spangled Banner Trail, nps.gov/STSP gives you about the trail, connecting state, local, national sites as well. As Dan showed today, the American Battlefield Trust has a great map that overlays the Battle of Bladensburg, which you can get on their website, battlefields.org. But I'd be remiss if we didn't end with talking a little bit about great partners in from Emerging Revolutionary War, and that is the American Battlefield Trust. Not only do they want to preserve it, but they want to get people out to the sites. They want to educate as well. And so I don't know if the bottom of Dan's sweatshirt says preserve and educate, but we're going to pretend it does. So just stay, don't move the camera. But this summer, they are doing a Teacher Institute in Baltimore. There are limited spots still available, but one of the programs will take around to North Point and some of the sites of Baltimore. And so if you're an educator, museum professional, go to battlefields.org, search for the Teacher Institute, and secure one of those last remaining spots, and come out and listen to some historians and preservationists talk about the importance of Baltimore during multiple time frames. And so just wanted to give the plug there since they American Battlefield Trust so kindly let us to support us for this revelry as well. But I know if anybody's listening or watching in, they're like Dan and I, they're book lovers, because why be historians if you can't buy books? So as we wrap up here, Dan, can you name a book or two that you would recommend if someone wants to dig deeper into this subject?
Yeah, I'll give you two. The first one is The Burning of Washington by a fellow named Anthony Pitch. And the second one is called War in the Chesapeake, The British Campaigns to Control the Bay, 1813 to 1814 by Charles Niemeyer. Both are, I would highly recommend. And just to tag on to what Phil said, also be looking at, checking out our website, battlefields.org. We will also be having a virtual Teachers Institute, obviously for 3 days in July. Or later on in July of this year online. So be sure to check out that and some of the other events that we have coming up.
And so I'd tag on as well, a book that I went through for some of the prep on this. I'll show it here, Through the Perilous Fight, 6 weeks that saved the nation. And so it plenty of books are out there, obviously, as well, about this time frame. But it is very interesting because it is a time that we kind of changed some of our nomenclature about the United States from was to is, or is to was, and so forth. And so it does happen. And so this is where history does come alive. And so War of 1812, we'll do more presentations coming up throughout the summer. I know we have one that if you're very interested in, it'll just burnings, epic burnings of the War of 1812. I'll be led by some of our compatriots later in the summer. Just to give you a reminder of what's going on, though, around the emerging Revolutionary War. 2 weeks, we will come back on Mother's Day, May 14th. So let me be the first to wish all the mothers out there a happy early Mother's Day. And so if you want to finish your day, no better way to finish it than talking about the relationship between George Washington and his mother, Mary Washington. And that'll be the next Reb War Revelry on May 14th, 7 p.m. I know there was a little bit of an issue. We're trying to figure out on Facebook how to get our Facebook Live onto the event tab. But if you go to our page, emergingrevolutionarywar.org, like it, or you go to the blog, emergingrevolutionarywar.org, we'll have the updates there. If you did miss anything on this revelry, within 48 hours, it will be on our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to that. And also, if you're more mobile, we do have a podcast for wherever you get your podcast, just Emerging Revolutionary War. If you want to see some of us in person, though, we do have some things coming up. Check our blog, but we have a few tickets remaining for our 3rd annual bus tour. This time we're going south in November. We're actually being smart and trying to get the warmer weather. And we're going to talk about Charleston in the American Revolution, which will also be the next volume in the Emerging Revolutionary War series. And so that'll be coming out in the summer. So you can buy your book, read it, secure one of those last remaining tickets to the bus tour in November, and come join us in Charleston, South Carolina. And that is over Veterans Day weekend in November. So before we do go, Dan, thank you for taking some of your Sunday night to talk about the War of 1812 with me and sharing in the rich history of Baltimore, which also won today in baseball. So they're looking better as well. Camden Yards, named after another revolutionary or American history event, the Battle of Camden. But any final thoughts before we do sign off here?
Just a couple. Number one, I highly encourage everyone. The War of 1812 is somewhat of it is considered America's forgotten conflict, one of America's forgotten conflicts, especially when it comes to America's first 100 years. It's a very fascinating conflict. A number of very interesting individuals: William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson, George Armistead, Winfield Scott, just to name a few, to Tecumseh, come out of that war, participate in that conflict. It's a very interesting time in America history, very interesting time in world history. I'd highly encourage folks to go out, just go to Amazon, do some searches, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. Read up on the war. I think you'll find it as fascinating as Phil and I do. And again, I want to thank Emerging Revolutionary War for having me on tonight. Again, one of our many, many value partners. We really appreciate it. Any of our members, American Battlefield Trust members who are watching tonight, thank you for all that you do in helping our organization. We cannot do what we have done over the last 30 years without your support. We are very grateful for that.
And also, I'll throw it in as well that the list of characters that come out of the War of 1812 is how much Napoleon affects what is going on. Because even as the war ends, he is coming back again for his 100 days and so forth. And that spurs some of the actions that happens in Ghent. For once, the Americans actually have a treaty that does not happen in Paris. And so it actually happens in Ghent, G-H-E-N-T, Belgium, signed there. So just a little bit of history. And also like to thank one of our listeners that that has shared a lot tonight, William Thayer. Great. Thank you for some of your suggestions in the comments about things to visit. He's a native of Frederick, Maryland. And so thank you, sir, for putting that in. But otherwise, hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Sunday evening. Thank you for joining us here at Emerging Revolutionary Wars Red War Revelry. We'll see you in 2 weeks on May 14th and talk about George Washington and the mother of the country, Mary Ball Washington. So take care and have a great rest of your evening.
Good night.